As conversations around mold, microbial exposure, and indoor environmental health continue to evolve, the connection between restoration and remediation practices and medical science has never been more important. Today's discussion takes us beyond protocols and procedures and into the clinical realities that shape how exposure affects people in homes, schools, healthcare facilities, and other sensitive environments. And to do this, I'm pleased to welcome my first time guest, Dr. Andrew Heyman. He's the chair of Normie's Medical Advisory Board. We're going to explore how medical insight, standards development, and industry education intersect, and why that collaboration matters more now than ever before. Dr. Heyman, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Good to get to know you a little bit. I have seen you on some Normie projects in the past,
Yes.
so you're no stranger to this audience. But tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm originally from the Washington, D.C. area and spent a lot of time living in various cities on the East Coast. I did all of my medical training at University of Michigan, so I spent 16 years in Ann Arbor and um, became very interested at that time in sort of the blend of an academic life of a physician, in addition to having, kind of an active practice. Um, I currently have made a lot of transitions in life, and all I think in service of being very focused with respect to my work in mold, but also in service of, I think at this point, trying to live a more balanced life. And so, to that end, my wife, Eric, and I recently moved to New Zealand. And we had a unique opportunity to obtain a resident visa and decide to spend some time here and sort of try it on and see what life feels like halfway across the world in the South Pacific. We couldn't be happier, and it's afforded us a kind of lifestyle that I enjoy with respect to being outside a lot of the time, and sort of enjoying nature in sort of all of its forms. Everywhere you look, it's like a postcard here, and I think in some ways it's allowed me to sort of throttle back a little bit and ask the question, after having done and accomplished a lot in my career, kind of now what? And to have some quiet time to focus on that. And I think the obvious next step is the topic that we're talking about today, which is to really throw myself into the topic of mold illness and water damaged buildings, and asking some hard questions about um, what can I now do to help further the field. And that's a much bigger question than being in clinic and helping one patient at a time, or even the teaching and research that I've done. I think now is the time where there's been so much progress and insight in the field. It's ready to sort of mature into the next level, and I'd like to be a part of that maturation process.
Thank you for all that, and I look forward to this discussion. We're going to dig into some specific questions about the topic, but I have to ask about this New Zealand thing. So,
Mm,
you're working remotely, obviously meetings on Zoom and Teams with different individuals. Is that going
yes.
well for you?
It's going really well. In fact, better than I expected. As long as the day is planned,
Mm.
I really haven't missed a step. Most people don't know I'm in New Zealand,
Uh-oh.
and because so much of the world is has gone online and people work remotely. Um, and typically speaking, the way I think about it is my morning is the afternoon before in the States. And so that's the case right now. I'm speaking to you on a Tuesday morning and it's Monday afternoon for you. And but it really has worked out fine. And plus, I have so many colleagues and relationships in the States that if I need to sort of do something virtually there, um, it's been very easy to sort of manage all of that. And I kind of like the distance and the quiet. Um, I joked with my wife that she didn't realize when she started traveling with me a little bit for work over the last several years that, I had over 1 million miles on Delta and 1 million miles on United, and I think close to 1 million on American. And she said, when did all of that happen? I said, well, over the last 30 years, I've worked really hard, and I've done a lot of teaching and a lot of conferences, and and at some point you say, okay, enough is enough, but you put the work in. And so again, you sort of feel like there are moments in life where you need to make a transition and figure out what's the next phase. And New Zealand is part of that idea of what the next phase is.
Well, it's an adventure that you're living and you're still working and helping out in the industry with everything that you're passionate about with your work. And I understand that when you moved to New Zealand, you didn't just bring your wife.
We brought we we brought a menagerie. We brought 3 dogs, a cat, and 2 horses. So the process of transition, as you could imagine, um, it was complicated. It was, a little worrisome at times, making sure the animals were all okay. But we made it, and they all couldn't be happier. They're all living sort of the life of Riley here. So um,
Yeah,
that you could see them sort of really relax into the New Zealand lifestyle. There's a lot of freedom here. I like that, the idea of personal freedom, and you can kind of go where you want, and no one's going to bother you. We like to go down to the beach, and generally it's nobody is there, and we can walk the dogs on the beach, or she can ride her horses on the beach, and it feels very sort of idyllic in that regard. So we're definitely enjoying that aspect of the lifestyle here.
very cool. I've taken 2 cats across country in my car, and that's the extent of my taking
Oh,
animals
yeah,
abroad. So you figured it out, Dr. Heyman.
yeah,
If we
yeah.
need advice on how to move an animal, you're our
Oh,
guy.
I'm the guy, definitely.
Well, let's thank you for the background. That sets us up nicely because we'll be doing other projects together as well with CleanFacts and Normie and what you do. But let's talk about what initially led to your involvement with Normie. What interested you about the organization's mission and focus on standards and education that fit what you want to do?
It's a really good question, and one that I think um, you evolve into over time as a practitioner, and one that felt very responsible for being what I would call, and I talk to my graduate students about this at George Washington University, the complete practitioner. And and in some sense, that includes but goes beyond what's typically termed the 3 legs of the stool. And that means that it's a physician that has a clinical command, but also is active in education, either at the medical student level or the graduate level, and also research. And with that being said, those boundaries um, are still somewhat of a limit in this space in particular for a couple reasons. Number one, mold illness, if you want to call it that, is still not well recognized within conventional medicine. And so I have to spend a lot of time acting as an advocate. And it raises the level of importance for what we're doing. Uh, Currently, the way mold exposure is seen within the medical system is still based on the 2004 recommendations that it's merely or typically either an allergic response or there might at worst be a pulmonary involvement. And the world has sort of moved on, and there's a lot of research that's been published, not just by myself and my group, but others around the world, to show that there can also be an inflammatory response, um, that has far-ranging consequences to people's health. And when you sort of realize the degree to which people can be affected by these exposures and how honestly lives can be truly harmed as a result, one of the areas that becomes very important is to ask the question, what do I know about what creates a healthy living space? And that takes us right into the world of normie, because I might be a great clinician, but that doesn't mean I have a deeper understanding of the environments in which people live beyond testing for mold. And I realized that over the years, my best clinical outcomes with patients were when I worked closely with investigators and remediators. And I had to learn to speak their language, but I'm also realizing they have to learn to speak my language. And so my relationship with Normie and Doug Hoffman in particular has really evolved quickly over time because we both, I think, are at the same point in our careers where we've said the thick dividing line between the medical community and the indoor expert community has to be erased. And so, um, if the ultimate goal is kind of healthy people in healthy environments, by definition, we have to strengthen the relationships between groups like Normie and the medical community. And Doug has really taken a lead role in that regard. He's very progressive in that sense, and Normie's very progressive with that notion of um, there has to be a collaboration because ultimately this is about improved health outcomes. And so that's the kind of inspiration of where that relationship started.
Yeah, I had a conversation with Doug a while back, and he mentioned something along the lines of what you just shared, that seeing people in their environment where they have issues. He visited a home of someone who had an issue after many failed attempts to make them healthier until he saw something. So it was that interaction with
Mhm.
somebody, if that's what you were mentioning there, that made the difference. Not just being a clinician, but interacting with people, seeing them in their environment.
That's right. And this notion that um, you can't replace the value of sort of being in the environment in which people live. Many physicians nowadays, we don't have that privilege anymore. We
Mhm.
used to do home
Right.
visits. I was trained in them, but most of us don't do that anymore. And it's actually a discussion that I've had quite a lot with Doug, which is to say, I now think the remediator is the front line that's part of the primary care team for that patient. They're not just an ancillary professional. They're going to see things other people don't. And they're actually going to be routinely interacting with that client, maybe much more often than I ever would. And so the idea of improving their skill set in terms of communication, the broad sense of a therapeutic relationship, making sure that resources are offered to get that client into good clinical care if needed. Um, there's a untapped world, I
Mhm.
think, where the normie provider steps into a much bigger and much more important role.
So continuing on, I understand, Dr. Heyman, that you were instrumental in editing and improving what's called the Level 4 protocol for assessment and remediation. Can you talk about that? Tell us about what that is, how important that is to everyone in the industry, and also those that they serve, those who are suffering.
Uh, Broadly speaking, it was an effort to take a critical eye towards the remediation and sanitization techniques that were going on in the home. Why? not because what had come before was wrong, but the notion that people who were sick from these exposures um, probably have a higher level of reactivity and sensitivity than other people. And we think that that might be genetically mediated. And so, to that end, the techniques that need to be applied to the home for people who are really sick from that home needed to be of a more elevated, more aggressive style intervention. And so the level four, as it were, was that notion that we are now taking into account the medically sensitive patient, and that requires um, a different kind of strategy for assessment, remediation, sanitization that has to be more thorough, more aggressive, and it embraces the notion that people can truly be made very sick from these exposures. And the remediator plays a very central role in that process, a role they need to take seriously, that it's ultimately about the person's health in very deep and meaningful ways. And so the level four was a collaboration to try and meet that need, where we synthesized the best of what we know in terms of the remediation side with now what we know on the clinical side, that those two pieces have to be integrated. And that was the inspiration for why we went through the process of developing the level four approach.
Now, something else that you're involved in, you are the chair of the Normie Medical Advisory Board. Talk about what that is. Let's bring that back into the conversation because that's really part of your focus when you think about helping others, and that's what this is for. But what's the real purpose of the board, and why was it important for Normie to create this now instead of years ago?
Well, I think it was both a matter of sort of timing in addition to inevitability. And that is to say, the timing was the right people. You have leaders like Doug that understood and kind of embraced that um, there was more that could be done with how the home was addressed. And the inevitability was the science side, that we now were at the point where we're much better able to measure the impact of the home on its inhabitants clinically, and we're now much better at treating them. But I can't get a patient better if the home's not dealt with properly. There's no amount of fancy treatment in the world that I can bring to bear. And so the reason for the medical advisory board was to pull together a group of experts that would collectively look both at the science of what's going on the health side of the equation and make sure that that aligns with the philosophy, the teaching, and the competencies that Normie is now delivering to the Normie certified professional. And I don't think you can sort of be a fully expressed remediator, investigator without having some basic knowledge of the medical side of the equation. And the role of the medical advisory board is to not only inform the protocols writ large and normie, but also create resources so that the normie professional has now access to information about mold illness and why it's so important to understand that piece. So we play an important role in helping to sort of shape the future direction of where Normia is going. We're by no means experts in remediation, but our role is to help guide from the medical side. And because ultimately this is a public health issue and it requires a team-based approach in that regard. So that's why the medical advisory board, I think, is so central
Mhm.
to kind of the next evolution of norming.
It's exciting to see, Dr. Heyman. I've been in this industry a long time and never has been the focus been so much on medical and what we're talking about today than it is now. So good things to come, I'm sure. But let's talk about this, same with that medical perspective, and talk about the gaps, the biggest gaps between what you see with remediation right now and what your side, the clinical science tells us about exposure to microbial contamination.
Well, I think it gets down to um, a number of issues, really on the clinical side. And in some ways, it's sort of medicine's fault, quite frankly, because we have not taken seriously um, the health impact of a contaminated home. And where we have fallen short is number one, believing the story of patients. So, there's this sense that there are lots of individuals out there that are suffering, and, quote, their local practitioner can't find anything wrong. It's both because of a bias in how we're trained, but also a failure in developing reliable measurement tools clinically to demonstrate that, yes, this person is objectively sick. And in particular, it's causative, meaning from the home itself. And so, with that being said, the science has evolved quite a bit. And now we have some objective markers that are becoming quite reliable. And so it's the medical side's responsibility to be able to advocate for those patients. And one way to advocate for them is to, focus on what's causing the problem, which is the home or the built environment. You can't understand these patients outside of that context. And, therefore, um, you know, the way medicine needs to evolve is not only better training of primary care providers, but also to build the bridge with the home side and to create relationships, again, with groups like Normie, because otherwise these patients fall through the cracks. It's not the job of a Normie provider to diagnose these individuals. It's the job of the medical system. And that's the one, I think the big gap, quite frankly. I found that when you talk to remediators about this issue, they get excited. They say, wow, this is great. I've seen for years people suffering. Finally, medicine is waking up a little bit and wanting to talk about these things. Otherwise, there's this sense of deflation and that, the public has been let down essentially by a system that doesn't recognize this illness or understand it in a meaningful way. So the gap to me is really more so on the medical side.
Now, you mentioned that on the medical side of all this aren't experts in doing the work, but how do you see the advisory board influencing the training, the protocols, the guidance for those that do the work?
So um, it gets into, I think, a few things. Number one is standardization. And that is to say, we want protocols. We want sort of a general way that investigators and remediators approach the home. Um, it's no good if you have 20 remediators doing 20 different things. And the difficult job of Normie is to set a standard and deliver that education. That education, of course, needs to be informed by the medical advisory board to ensure that it's of a certain level so that it meets the need of the medically sensitive patient. And so those two lines have to come into congruency. One of the reasons why we also need standardization in that role um, is because our bigger vision is to blend a data collection process where we start investigating and measuring what's done in the home, but also what's done for the people living in the home clinically. And that begins to allow us to get to what we call outcomes-based research. We can't answer the question, did we do the right thing and did we do it right? If you have 20 remediators doing 20 different things and 20 practitioners doing 20 different things, the outcomes won't be reliable or understandable. We need to start getting um, all of the professionals in this space moving in a certain direction so that the measurement of the outcomes becomes more reliable. And this is a resource and an approach that Normie and myself and others are putting in place now. So, one of the additional roles of the medical advisory board is not just to sort of advise on the education side, but to step into a broader role with respect to research. And to that end, I think that's going to be potentially our greatest leverage point for changing the field. Right now, the chapter in the textbook of medicine on this subject is very thin and extremely incomplete. It's essentially empty. And I think if we can begin to build a foundation of better education on the normie professional side and better education on the practitioner side, it sets us up to do more meaningful outcomes research that my hope will change medicine. It will change the field of remediation. Um, but the first piece is what we're doing right now. We're aligning how we think, we're aligning knowledge, we're aligning competencies. And then very quickly behind that, we'll be overlaying a research agenda, which I think is incredibly exciting, quite frankly.
I agree 100%. Um, Cleaning and restoration professionals, they do their work everywhere. But let's talk about, I guess we could say, higher liability settings, schools, healthcare facilities. They do their work there, some homes as well. But how does medical insight help clarify the risk in those types of environments?
Well, I think it helps clarify the risk several ways. Number one, with the advent of genomics and other more advanced measurement tools, we are now better able to understand what are the types of microbes that might be present um, that are affecting the individuals that are inhabiting those higher risk places. And so we have to sort of be very savvy around understanding um, what does amplified microbial growth mean, both in terms of measurement, but also impact. The impact side, I think, is where a lot of the breakthroughs have been happening. We now can measure the ways in which different genes turn on and off with different kinds of exposures. 10 years ago, we could never do that. And it's the advent of this field of what we call omics, which is not just measuring the genes you have, but more importantly, measuring what are your genes doing in reaction to your environment. That's an enormous breakthrough. There are also long-term consequences to living and working in these contaminated spaces. And one of the other areas of, I think, breakthrough research is our group has shown that there's a subpopulation of people whose brains actually can become damaged by virtue of the inflammatory response. And when you talk about more critical environments that are, quote, higher risk, we need to ensure that in particular those environments are safe. So we need to be very thorough and complete in how we measure and what we measure. We need to be complete in its um, broad impact on the individuals that are inhabiting those spaces, with an eye towards the serious consequences that can arise in that regard. And I've certainly seen healthcare facilities, school buildings, um, military installations, and many more that are affected. And when you think about, in particular, vulnerable populations, um, particularly with brain health, it becomes a very worrisome notion, whether it's your grandmother in a nursing home who already has dementia that could be made worse because of mold exposure, or a Marine in a barracks who's suffered multiple concussions, who's now living in a moldy environment, or even a professional athlete who has not only risk of concussion and stress, but also maybe performing in a stadium that's moldy. I see this everywhere. Or, for example, school buildings where you have kids that are having neuroinflammatory reactions that might mimic the behaviors of ADHD or um, spectrum disorder or poor learning and focus, and they get labeled as learning disabled, when in fact it's the environment that's affecting the children. And I see this over and over and over. These are critical populations that deserve a certain level of attention and care that they're just not getting.
You mentioned in the past 10 years we've come a long ways. What about the next 10 years?
Hmm.
It may be amazing what you can do.
I think the next 10 years, we're going to see an acceleration of our
Mhm.
insights, um, especially on the medical side.
Mhm.
And I think there are certain categories or topics that um, will come into greater focus. Number one, capturing a broader array of what's making people sick in the built environment. Um, Newer measurement strategies like DNA methylation techniques allows us to be much more precise, both in terms of what's the exposure, but also, even maybe more importantly, the molecular biology of how the body's reacting and responding to these various exposures. It's not all the same. And so the ability to peer ever more deeply inside the cell, down into the DNA, the power of that approach is really showing itself in this field in particular. And the newer measurement techniques that are now just becoming available, I think are incredibly exciting, may fully reshape how we look at the ways in which people biologically react to the environment. That then forms a better basis for more precise and personalized treatment. And at the same time that our measurement capacity is improving, there's been an explosion of what I would call regenerative therapies that show a lot of promise with respect to reducing inflammation, restoring normal genomic activity, and repairing damaged tissues and organs. We are going well beyond normal pharmaceuticals and getting into the area of peptides, exosomes, stem cells, personalized hormonal regimens. There's a whole new toolkit that is emerging within medicine. It's very much on the distance, it's very much cutting edge, but it's here. And when you blend new technical insights with much more powerful regenerative techniques, you now have a basis for helping to correct what otherwise is a very insidious disease.
Mhm. Let's talk about, there's an ongoing debate in the industry. I've heard this over the years about symptoms, exposure, thresholds, occupant health. Some see the issue, some don't. Talk about a little bit more about that. What role can medical guidance play in bringing clarity and consistency to these discussions, thinking about that viewpoint of that exposure?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is the tension between um, sort of an older disease model, which is really more so in a toxicology context. And
True.
that is to say, asking how much of a toxin needs to be present before I see a reaction.
Hmm.
And one of the things that the new science, if you want to call it that, has done is allowed us to escape the conundrum and debate of that idea. And it's demonstrated that there can simultaneously or differentially be other kinds of bodily reactions outside of the toxicology model, that even minute amounts of an exposure can lead to logarithmic reactions within the immune system in particular. And so you get these enormous inflammatory responses. And there's a whole biology around that idea with priming events and trained immune responses and specialized cells that are learning to react to very small amounts of antigens or exposures, and that we're breaking free of that toxicology model of if I have so much of this, I have so much of a reaction. If I have more of this, I have more of a reaction. The immunologic model, and I would call it kind of it's a genomic immunologic model, demonstrates, and it actually proves in some ways what people have been saying for a long time, that you can have a small exposure and still be very sick. And they're not crazy, because that's part of where that goes in terms of a argument and a discussion. You have an individual who's living in a home and you don't measure that much mold, for example, but they're really sick. And you say, well, there's no way this person could be this ill. Well, it turns out they can be. And it's because of these other ways in which the body is learning to react in an aggressive response that is far beyond what you think would occur within a toxicology model. This is the kind of debate that I have, quite frankly, in a lot of legal cases. The defense counsels love to bring up, well, Dr. Heyman, there was only a small amount of X in the home. How can you claim the person is so sick? How do you know what the threshold is? What is the threshold for ochratoxin or aflatoxin or this or that? What does the literature say? And they try and trap you literally in that model. And so I have to be savvy to kind of escape and say, well, wait a minute, there's other ways in which the body can respond. And so part of my job as an educator is to help professionals understand the differences in this approach, and that they can also live side by side. You can have a toxicology model, whereas mycotoxins build up in the system and they directly harm and injure tissue, but you can also have an immunologic model where a small amount of mycotoxins generate an enormous inflammatory response. One doesn't necessarily exclude the other.
Talk about the collaboration between medical professionals and remediation practitioners improving outcomes. What's that look like? You have two different camps. They've got to come together. I know in the classroom
Well,
they can, but beyond that.
I think so, and I think first and foremost, whenever you have providers who have different kind of professional backgrounds, it means, and essentially they have different knowledge bases. What it also really means is they speak different languages in a sense. And so one of the I think jobs or goals of beginning to create a cohesive community around the subject is making sure that there's a common language that's spoken. And so, to that end, I'm very happy to announce that we are now launching two courses at my university, George Washington University, to help professionals in the space speak the same language. So, we have one course for investigators and remediators and IEPs. And it's designed as a basics course so that they learn to speak the medical language. And and that will go hopefully a long way, both in terms of how that professional communicates with the client in the home, but also how they communicate with a treating provider. Simultaneously, we have a second course that we're launching, and it's for practitioners. It's a much more in-depth and detailed course on assessment and treatment of mold illness. And part of that is understanding the built environment. And so the course is also designed to help practitioners speak the language of the investigator and the remediator. It's the beginning point. And while some of this seems obvious, this has never been done. There's no university, there's no place a person can go to sort of synthesize these communities in this way. This is the first time. And a lot of this, I think, was, again, inspired by these conversations that I've been having with Normie and others to say, where do we begin? It's such a big problem. And well, you begin in the beginning. And that is to say, we need to all at first be on the same page. And then we can start asking questions about how do we solve our collective problems. But I'm thrilled that we now have these courses available that we can certify remediators in mold illness. And I can certify practitioners in the treatment of mold illness. That to me is the starting point. And then from there, we begin to invest ourselves in improving the protocols for the home, the treatment protocols of the patient, building a research model around that, tracking outcomes. But the starting point is education and building competencies. And we finally crossed that threshold.
Sounds pretty exciting. Two special courses to address these issues. My next question might be answered partly by that information because I'm thinking from your vantage point, cleaning and restoration professionals, what can they do to better understand microbial contamination, maybe what's underestimated or misunderstood today? Will those two opportunities help with that? Maybe you can dig into
They
that a little
will.
bit more.
They will. And
Okay.
so that the Mold Basics course is designed specifically to educate the remediator on the essentials of mold illness, to understand what is this new immunologic model, how does that generate a variety of symptoms, how might I talk to that individual? What are the tools that I have at my disposal to maybe help detect that that's going on? Who do I refer to and when? There's a big role that remediators can step into, again, as sort of a front line of primary care in a way that was always there. But now we're trying to build resources so that not only can we activate remediators, but we give them a direction in terms of the what to do in term with respect to how do I speak to a client, where can I refer them clinically, and the rest. We're building all of this, kind of at the same time. It's been an enormous effort, but it's a signal. The field is changing and maturing, and I'm thrilled to be a part of it.
So these two courses, are they going to be in person, virtual? Are you going to teach them? When will we know more?
They are through George Washington
Mhm.
University. They are virtual. They're also self-paced. So a remediator can sign up and then on his or her own go through the learning material. There's some readings that we're having them do. There's some video content that they'll watch. And then there's a few basic questions at the end of the course. Once they complete, they will get a certificate. And that distinguishes them to say, not only am I, let's say, normie certified, but I'm also certified through George Washington University that I am now an elevated professional who is more aware of the mold illness side of the equation. And that distinction we know is something that remediators want. It segments them in the marketplace. It will improve the decisions that they make and how they remediate and how they communicate with their clients. It's the next evolution, quite
Mhm.
frankly. It's inevitable. Yep.
All right, last point. We talked about the future a bit, but let's do it again. Looking ahead, what you're doing with the Medical Advisory Board and Normie, that partnership, that working together. What will you see in the next few years as a something you could really point to as a win?
I think in the next few years, we'll be publishing our first articles on answering two questions. What did we do for the home? And what did we do for the people living in the home? And what were their outcomes? It will be the first time we've done that. It will reshape the landscape of our field. It will elevate the role of the remediator. It will elevate the role of the practitioner. It will finally put the patient in the center of that equation. And ultimately, we're going to get to the point where um, this will improve how medicine sees the whole subject, and it will hopefully, in some ways, force medicine to change and to kind of break free of the old allergic or toxicology model and sort of step into this new world of new measurement tools, of new recognition of how sick people can be from these exposures, the critically important role that remediators play in getting a home safe, that it has everything to do with your brother's diabetes, your sister's thyroid problem, your mom's dementia, your daughter's difficulty with weight gain, and the rest. The degree to which mold exposure affects every body system is profound. And I cannot overstate how important the role is of normie providers to stand side by side and shoulder to shoulder with medical professionals to solve, quite frankly, what I think is one of the biggest failures of primary care and public health. Do you know how many problems we can solve clinically if we get this right? It may be one of the most important advances that has happened in the 21st century of medicine. And I'm not overstating that. There are millions and millions and millions of people that are affected by their homes, for example. And as you know, there are millions and millions and millions and millions of domiciles that are contaminated. And we are continually chasing our tail with chronic illnesses and mood disorders and autoimmune conditions and cancer and trying to find the right drug for that. And nobody's asking the question, what would happen if we all lived in clean homes? And we're going to put a lot of people out of business, quite frankly, and I hope we do. So so in the next few years, I'd love to say we've published some really seminal articles. We got the attention in the medical community. We're placing into a proper frame the role of the remediator as part of sort of a medical team and a public health effort, and that we're really changing the narrative on this whole topic. It's an exciting time, honestly, and to be part of a new area of clinical insight doesn't happen very often, but it's going to happen here. I know it will.